Okay, we are live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to everybody from Idaho and anybody who is watching across the country because you never know who we can reach. Um, we are here today with HannaLore Hein. She is the state historian from the Idaho State Historical Society, and this is such a treat. She is going to give us a Idaho history class and touch on some really fun topics. And so I'm just going to hand it over to HannaLore for a moment so she can talk about, what she does at the Idaho State Historical Society and just give us a little bit of background.
Well, good morning. And Jennifer, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here speaking with everyone this morning and sharing not just my knowledge of Idaho history, but my passion for this field of study as well. I have, just by means of background, been with the Idaho State Historical Society for about 5 years in my role as state historian. And interestingly enough, I'm only the fifth named state historian in state history, and first woman to hold the role since it required professional degrees and credentialing. So I
Wow.
love the work. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. And in my day-to-day job, really at the top of the list of responsibilities includes serving as a content matter expert.
Mhm.
So really having a good understanding of the state's history, of the regional history, and using that expertise to help advance agency projects and initiatives. But I also serve as that subject matter expert for state government and specifically the governor's
Mm.
office and the legislature as well.
Wow. Wow, that's great. That sounds really interesting, actually.
It is
It must keep you on
every
your
day.
toes.
Yes, it does.
Wow. All right, so do you wanna, tell everybody what we're going to be learning about today?
Yeah, so I've built out a presentation that kind of gives what I'm calling, I guess, case studies for lack of a better term, that look at moments in Idaho's past. But hopefully, throughout the talk, we can also talk about how I gained the knowledge that I have on these topics, and how you, as a student, can also think of a historian's process kind of through an investigative lens.
Mm. All right, sounds great. All right, so do you wanna start and then I'll just jump off into the background. I'll still be here, but I'll be
Okay,
in the background. I'm gonna let HannaLore take over and do her
excellent.
do her thing.
Great. And I do see some comments coming through. So if anyone has questions, please drop those comments. And I think Jennifer can help
Mhm.
manage that communication between
Yep,
the two, between everyone that's on the call. So,
definitely.
all right, I will share my screen. All right. And I think that means everyone can see it. All right. So I always like to start presentations like this with students kind of at the baseline of thinking about what is the work that a historian does. And I do this because regardless of all of the information that I'm going to share with you today, I don't ever like people to assume that I just happen to have this knowledge and that, I just know it. I am fortunate in that I was trained as a historian, and I understand the methods and the processes and the steps that one goes through. But I think it's important, again, to acknowledge that I have to work to learn what I learned. So, in a lot of ways, I'm in the same boat as a lot of the students out there in the world trying to understand the past. It's very investigative. And I think the best way to think about, what is a historian? How does that title kind of manifest? Is to think about what we touch to know the past. So I like to think of historians as somebody who's really good at looking through the mail, right? We can go through old documents and old pieces of paper, and if we were to look to the past, we're really going through that paper archival documentation to know more about those who came before us. Now, I have a lot of colleagues who work in adjacent fields like archaeology. So, to put this understanding into context, you can kind of think of an archaeologist as somebody who might be looking through the trash. So they may have more interest in understanding the physical objects that have been left behind, the shards of pottery, or items that maybe actually were trash that were thrown out adjacent to an old homestead, or things like that. And of course, any remnants from the past is going to help inform our understanding of the past and of those who lived before us. But a historian's focus is typically on that paper record. And I also want to quickly kind of go over the distinction between where history falls in larger fields of study. So, sometimes if you're going to go into college, the history department is in the College of Arts and Sciences. Sometimes the history department is in the College of Social Sciences. And so I like to think of history, knowing that it can kind of shapeshift, as being both an art and a science. And you might be thinking, well, how does that work? What do you mean by that? Well, most people, if you or students, have had a chance to probably participate in one or more science fairs over the course of your life. And you know that going through a science fair, you follow a very specific method, right? It's the scientific method of determining what your hypothesis is, planning your experiment, conducting that experiment, gathering your results, and then coming to conclusions. History really aligns to that process. And you can almost think of that historical method in those same very systematic steps, right? Where you're going to think about your research question, you're going to try to really nuance what it is you're seeking, and then you're going to identify all of the potential sources of information to answer that question. You're going to be very methodical when you review those documents. And then, much like a scientist, you're going to come to conclusions about that information, right? And herein is where the distinction really lies between the past, which are the events, the things, the people, the places that came before us, and history, which is our understanding of the past, and being able to use that knowledge to make better decisions about today and about the future. So if that's kind of how it likes to, masquerade as a science, how does history then masquerade as an art? And this is the part where creativity is really central, because you can go through that methodical process and look at the same documents as maybe another historian. But if you decide to present that information slightly differently, or with a different tone, or in a different order, you may have more success in reaching your intended audience. So that's where this really presents like an art, because you have to be creative in how you share the stories you're investigating. So I hope that helps kind of give a better glimpse into the work that I get to do, being that subject matter expert, and the work that you get to do in your history classes and in studying the past. It really is quite investigative. So when we think about that method, right, that scientific or historical method of what are we here to learn? Typically, we want to craft research questions on the front end of any project. And so when I get into kind of my case studies of today's presentation, we can talk about, the questions that most people want to ask about these times in history. But generally, you should be thinking about the questions historians asked kind of through a lens, right? So I've put a couple here on the screen, just because these are questions that I often ask of the past. And I'm almost hoping that as you guys look at these, that you can start thinking about how do we bucket these questions into kind of categories. So, if we were to look at some of these and think, okay, well, what lessons can we learn from the past? That's kind of a context question, right? That gives us that big kind of overview of what happened and what can we learn from it, and being able to put moments from the past into broader contexts is something that historians are really good at doing, and you can be good at doing too. Causes and effects, those kinds of questions often fall into the category of causation, right? It's not just what were those things that led up to an event, but like, what was the mindset of the people of the time that made them think a certain way to then have those events transpire in a certain direction or a certain, time frame. The third question on the list, what's changed, what has remained the same? That kind of a question and similar questions fall into the category of comparison, right? And why might comparison be a good approach or framework to thinking about the past? Well, it's good because it automatically puts you and the past into conversation, right? You can think about things today, or you can think about things from a different historical time period. And by simply comparing that to an earlier era or a later era, you can draw certain conclusions and you can think about things in a certain way. I always like to remind folks that, history is not just about remembering dates and places and people and a chronology of events, but it's about how those actions of any historical player, whether they were really important, great men, or whether they were other kids or other individuals, people from maybe less visible or represented groups. What did those actions lead to today and into the future? That next question about, thinking about worldview is really about as much understanding relationships and kind of that category of question making as anything else, because again, kind of similar to the context questions, having a better understanding of people's worldviews in that relational construct really builds empathy. And I think empathy in our world today is really important to foster, and studying history can help do that. And then the last question that's on this list, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, is really thinking about how historians work. And even in my work that I do for the governor's office or for other really important key stakeholders, I always make it a point to talk about methods and context and process in my work for two very specific reasons. Firstly, like I started this talk saying, it's important to share with the world that historians are not just born with this volume of data and information in our heads. There are steps we go through to learn this, and we go through those steps specifically to be able to then share our knowledge with others. And I think it's just important for our field of study to talk about how we do history, not just what we know about the past. So with that kind of background, now we're going to jump into kind of our case studies. And again, I'm seeing comments coming through the chat, so this is great. I don't know if there's a way to kind of, say how many people are familiar with Idaho's tribal history or not. But when I talk about tribal history, I always like to acknowledge on the front end that, where I'm based, which is in Boise, these were the original homelands of the Shoshone Bannock and Shoshone Paiute people, and that those tribes were forcibly removed by the U.S. government in the 1860s. And so we honor and acknowledge that land. But I also, I'm very mindful of the fact that this is not necessarily my history to tell. So I encourage everyone at the end of this presentation to do your own research and investigate this story, these stories, to be able to make sure that you're hearing it from the tribe's perspective as well. So the information that I have up here on the screen are just really some highlights. So if you're not familiar with tribal history at all, again, here's my big, broad overview of some context. Idaho does have 5 federally recognized tribes, but that's not to say that other tribal people didn't at one point call Idaho home, or that they don't call Idaho home today. This simply recognizes the tribes who engaged with the federal government at some point in their past and have kind of a legal recognition and are being basically managed through a trust relationship with the U.S. government. If we think about Idaho geographically from the north to the south, the Kootenai tribe is at the very top of that list, or rather top of that map, with their land and their reservation. And the Kootenai tribe was at one part of the larger Kootenai tribe that is now situated in Montana and parts of Canada. And although there was a treaty signed in 1855 giving that tribe reservation land in Montana, the Idaho Kootenai were not party to that negotiation. And so the Kootenai tribe of Idaho remained in Idaho through most of the 1800s, 1900s. And it wasn't until October of 1974 that this tribe actually received reservation lands from the US government and federal, more official federal recognition. So they're at the very, very top of the panhandle. Farther south, we then have the Coeur d'Alene. The Coeur d'Alene tribe has inhabited the area around Coeur d'Alene Lake since time immemorial. And they did go through a treaty, negotiation, an attempt to create a reservation through treaties. But ultimately, that land was then set aside by an executive order in 1873. And the land, of course, that is considered tribal land today is much smaller than the original homelands of the Coeur d'Alene people. The other interesting thing about the Coeur d'Alene Reservation is that it is considered a checkerboard reservation, meaning that portions of that land had been kind of allotted out or separated out for individual ownership, and that there are plots that are owned by non-native people within the reservation boundaries. And that's not the only reservation set up like that, but it is one of them here in Idaho. Farther south, near kind of Lewiston, we have the Nez Perce tribe. And again, their Aboriginal homeland was millions of acres at one point. And the Nez Perce tribe, in addition to being very important to Idaho's early history with the Lewis and Clark expedition, they were also really at the forefront of Idaho's territorial history, because that's where the first gold strike hit in the 1860s, early 1860s, was on Nez Perce Aboriginal lands. And that treaty of 1855 did establish a reservation, but like I said, with the gold rush, the federal government had an incentive to really readjust those reservation lines. And so now the Nez Perce tribal lands are about 90% of what they originally were. If we go then farther south, again, most of southern Idaho was at one point home to Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute people of different bands. And there are two reservations set aside for individuals of these tribal nations. The one that's farthest east is the Shoshone Bannock Reservation at Fort Hall, and that was established via a treaty in 1868. And then the Shoshone Paiute Reservation, which is just slightly southwest of where most of you guys are in the Magic Valley. That one, like the Coeur d'Alene, was established via a executive order. So again, highlight of the fact that Idaho was party to the kind of treaty-making era in U.S. history. And in the West, most of those treaties occurred, between the 1850s and the 1870s. That's not to say that other treaties and other legal interactions didn't take place with other tribes east of us much earlier in the country's history. But I go back to the framework I set up in the beginning. How do we think about these moments in time, these tribal people's experience, and the experience of the government agents who were negotiating these treaties and who were representing the U.S. government? Well, the best way to do that is to really look at the original source material. So I invite all of those who are watching to scan the QR code that's on the screen here. This, fingers crossed, should take you to a federal website known as the Ratified Treaties kind of database. And in partnership with the National Archives and a number of other federal partners, over the last, I don't know, probably a couple of years, there was a real effort to digitize and make available information about the treaties that were signed between federal tribes and the US government. And so, what I encourage you all to do in going to that and navigating to that website is to look through those original documents and to actually read the language and to put yourself in the position of somebody from that era, maybe trying to understand the worldview or the mindset of the tribal people, knowing English was not their first language. And then you look at the legalese in these treaties. And it just, again, should bring a sense of empathy on their part, but also on the part of those, again, who were doing the negotiations, to try to better understand what that moment in time meant for all of those involved. I also encourage you guys not to just read the transcription of these treaties, because yes, that's typed out, it's easy to digest, but look at that handwriting, look at those documents, look at the age of the paper that most of these treaties were drafted on. The tangible context of what that paper means to most people who are still party to those decisions today, it carries a lot of weight. So, at the end, I'll make sure everyone has my contact information who's watching, but I would love to hear what your experience was in looking at those original documents. And again, thinking about the kinds of research questions you can ask of those documents, knowing that you kind of now have a general overview of tribal history. And Jennifer, if there are questions coming in, feel free to pop in and read those out to me, since I may not be able to see them as I'm presenting.
I will.
Great. So after you have done your due diligence of looking at your primary source materials, I want to then bring this moment of tribal history to the present, because tribal nations, tribal people are not something that are stuck in the past, that are lost to the past, that are only in the past. There are over 500 federally recognized tribes across the United States and territories today, and many of them are thriving. They are working very hard to undo some of the persecution that they have faced over decades and centuries. And so one of those moments, or one of those opportunities to really lean into Native culture and history today is through a program of the National Museum of the American Indian. So this organization is part of the Smithsonian Institution, and they do some really great online programs, online exhibitions. And so again, I encourage you to scan the QR code. This should, again, fingers crossed with all my links, should take you straight to their Native Cinema Showcase. And so you'll see the dates on here that in a couple of weeks, they're going to be highlighting films that are produced by Native peoples about Native peoples. And, film, I think, is a really amazing medium to introduce people to topics that maybe are contentious, that can be hard to digest. Film is a way to kind of find that common denominator to the human emotion. So I did watch the trailer on this as I was building out my slide deck, and there are several films that I think I'm going to try to watch once this showcase is live in November. Okay, so that's kind of our first case study. Now I'm going to move us forward in time just a little bit to the experiences of westward migration Oregon Trail travelers. So since you guys are in the Magic Valley, you are probably pretty well versed in the history of the Oregon Trail, given that this trail traversed your backyards. But again, I'll give you some general broad context. So Idaho history, again, as a territory, we didn't exist until 1863. But thousands and tens of thousands of people came through what would eventually become Idaho, beginning in the 1840s. And there's reason for that. And we can actually thank Oregon and maybe Great Britain for that stream of migration. But there had been people here even in the early 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, fur trapping, both in southern Idaho and northern Idaho. And at the time, Oregon, Washington, parts of Montana, and Idaho were considered Oregon country. And this land had been jointly occupied between the United States and Great Britain. And then in the late 1840s, that joint occupation ceased, and the United States acquired the land at the boundary with Canada, and Great Britain kept what was north of that, and that eventually became part of Canada proper. But the United States was fearful that unless they filled this land with, white American settlers, there may be a interest by another international, geopolitical entity to come in and say, oh, there's no one out there, I'm going to try to take it. So in 1850, the federal government passed a law that allowed for people to acquire land in Oregon for free if they could get there and claim it. And so that really intensified this wave of westward migration. Wagon trains that, were coming not just with, a family, but like hundreds of families. And they moved across the land in droves. Now, I do have some excerpts from primary source materials that I'm happy to share after our talk that kind of put into context what it is that they were seeing as they were coming across the landscape. So I'm going to read some quotes. This is from Esther Bell Hanna, and she said, "This region extends for 150 or 1,000 miles. If the scale was unimaginable, so too was its dreariness. No one can imagine the barren and desolate appearance of this part of the country unless you could see it." 1853. Cordon Cone, in his diary, wrote, "A deep gloom hangs over my mind when I contemplate this vast country. The want of summer rain in this season, and that no vegetation is to be found here, is the same reason that it cannot grow here, and consequently this country will never be settled, as a population could not exist." 1849. Amelia Knight Stewart wrote, "It is dust from morning until night, with now and then a sprinkling of gnats and mosquitoes, and as far as the eye can see, it is nothing but a sandy desert covered in sagebrush, dried up with heat." 1853. So if you were to read those primary source documents, would you agree with their interpretation of Southern Idaho? If you were to get out of the Magic Valley where irrigation has turned everything green, and you really are in the throngs of the sagebrush high desert plateau, can you sense their sense of despair, or their sense of fear, or their sense of concern about what it is they're going through, right? And then can you also put yourself into their into that perspective and think, within 100 years of these diary entries, the population of Idaho Territory was several 100,000 people. And so how can you go from thinking about a place that is going to stay uninhabited, to it becoming a place that is not only supporting life, but one in which life thrives? And then you can put your, investigator hat back on and get out your magnifying glass, and say, what are the sources that I can turn to better understand the change over time from 1853 to 1953 or to 2023? And that's when you can start to see how people's decisions impacted things well beyond their lifetime, and how having the knowledge of those decisions puts us in a better position to make decisions for the next 100 years or the next 50 years. So where might you go to learn more about westward migration history, and some of the other kind of sub-narratives about the movement of people? Well, again, please feel free to scan the QR code here on the screen. But this particular site and again, I think place-based history is really important, is a bridge that is in downtown Boise. The bridge itself was built in the 1930s. You can kind of see from the pillars that there's some really great Art Deco ornamentations, really beautiful lines. And although the bridge is from the 1930s, the site of this bridge was an original ferry crossing for westward travelers. And what is a ferry? A ferry is a boat that takes you from one bank of the river across the river to the other bank. It does not travel up and down the river, it travels across the river. Ferries existed up and down the Snake River, on the Boise River, on all of the rivers in Idaho and across the West, because people had wagons and oxen and all kinds of things that they needed to bring with them, and there were no bridges, right? Bridges didn't come until much later on. So I point to this site as a place to understand westward migration history, but also transportation history, because the site is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And that's a program that our agency is responsible for implementing through our State Historic Preservation Office. And this program is a federal program that recognizes sites that have historic significance and historic integrity. And there's a distinction between those two, and that might be content for another presentation. But we're really looking for places, buildings, structures that help tell the story of the past, and that also have integrity across a number of different criteria. So is the setting the same? Is the material the same? And clearly, when you're looking at a bridge that's almost 100 years old, that cars still drive over, again, this is where the archaeologists or some of those other history adjacent professions will look at this bridge and say the bridge itself has a story to tell. Yes, it was a ferry crossing, but the bridge itself also has a story to tell. So the QR code on the screen is going to take you to a National Register nomination for this bridge. And it's several, I think it's at least 20 or 30 pages long. It talks about the entire site's history and the significance of the architecture of the bridge itself. So again, what I think is really important about this story is that you start to see how history can be layered. One site has significance for one era, something happens at that site, it has significance for another era, and you could even look over the course of the last 100 years and say, what other events happened at this bridge that were critical to Idaho history? And you can think about marches, like Martin Luther King marches in the 1980s, when they were trying to get that date recognized as a federal holiday and a state holiday, and people marching up and down that bridge, and people having an experience in that place. So I think more than anything, place-based histories are important, but it's also important to acknowledge that there could be multiple perspectives about that site's history that you can explore. So then the last case study that I want to kind of lean into is one that I've had a real opportunity to learn a little bit more about in my role as state historian, and that's women's history. And so I have kind of a representative, I have some representative images on the screen of women who were very involved in society clubs in the early 1900s, late 1800s. The Boise Columbian Club is the oldest federated club in the state of Idaho. It was first established in 1892, specifically with the purpose of helping Idaho be prepared for the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair. And so what that meant was, imagine the largest fair in the world, whereby every state and other countries would bring in exhibitions or build buildings. I mean, this is a massive scale event. And the women of this club were responsible for furnishing and decorating a 3-story log cabin to tell Idaho's history. And not only did they rise to the occasion and fundraise for this event, but they pulled it off with, exceptional work, and then came back and decided, we still have work to do in our community. If we can raise money for a fair to bring, interest to Idaho, we can do community work to make Idaho a better place for the people who live here. This particular club is still an active women's organization, if you can believe that. There are about 35 members of the Columbian Club, and they've had just a remarkable run of an existence in terms of making impacts in the community. This club was responsible for bringing the first kindergarten to Idaho, as well as establishing the first libraries. And that work in building libraries led to the creation of the state library, which still exists today. It's now kind of housed under the Commission for Libraries. They've helped veterans, they've helped students, they've helped American Indians, they've done city beautification, a number of different projects. Women's history is something that has not always had a focus. Rather, there hasn't always been a focus on it. But in the 1960s and 70s, historians who were trying again to hone their methods started to think about categorizing history into more manageable topic areas. So you start to see the emergence of gender history, of women's history, of Native American history, of environmental history, of political history, as opposed to saying we're just going to tell one big, broad narrative that doesn't give space for individual stories or experiences to shine. And Idaho's women's history, I think, is really critical when you think about things from a national perspective, because not only was Idaho a rather progressive state, right, when we achieved statehood in the 1890s, but we also were one of the first states to extend suffrage to women. We were the fourth state to do that in 1896, well before the passage of the 19th Amendment, which extended suffrage to women nationally. And the women who were partaking in these kind of societal efforts were really thinking to the future. You know, they were thinking about preserving the Sawtooth Mountains well before there was national effort to pass legislation to create wilderness or to create, reserved recreation areas. And again, just the work that they were doing with education and all of these different things not only had a benefit to society, but it had a benefit for the women participating, kind of through this reciprocal relationship, you know? So you look, again, going back to those original questions, what was the cause of some of this? Well, they were trying to find a voice for themselves in society. That was an original impetus behind why women's clubs formed and how women recognized that communally in larger groups, that their voices could be amplified and their impact could be larger. So I think one of the most remarkable things about the women's movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s is that it legitimized volunteerism. It legitimized the field of social work. It legitimized women in elected positions, especially those that had an impact on other women or children, such as, you know, the positions of school superintendents and serving on school boards. So, again, all of this to say that while there have been a number of minority groups that have been fighting to have more visibility and more voice in society, in religion, in politics, in culture, the women's movement was doing that here in Idaho very, very early on. So how do we honor and recognize that story? Well, one of the ways that we as an agency do that is through commemorations. And so the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, if you weren't aware, was first passed in 1920. And so it was just a couple of years ago that we celebrated the centennial of that moment in time. And I find as a historian that, and I think, you know, a lot of people can look at things this way. If you have an anniversary date that ends in a 0 or a 5, there's reason to celebrate it and to honor it and commemorate it. And of course, to reach 100 years of something is a pretty big deal when our country is only 250 years old. So the pictures that are here on the screen are of a statue that the Idaho State Historical Society invested in with partners in the nonprofit space in 2020 to show the kind of trajectory of women's work over time. And so what you see on those stones are shoes. And these shoes are all shoes, real shoes that are held in the collections of the Idaho State Museum. And we pulled those out of our collection and had them cast in bronze. And they show change over time. So we have moccasins from Native American tribes. We have shoes from women who would have maybe worked in schools or other early establishments in the 1880s. We have military combat boots. We have ranching cattle boots. We have dance shoes. And then you see in the picture of the woman handing that shoe ahead of her, she's really passing on all of the knowledge, all of the experience, all of the wisdom that women have gained over time to the next generation. So there's really great symbolism here while also honoring those physical artifacts that really do tell stories. So where can you go to learn more about women's history? And again, look at those primary sources, do the investigations yourselves, learn from the documents. If you scan the QR code, it should take you to a digital content platform called Content DM. It's housed, a feature that's housed under the Idaho State Archives. And there's a collection there that is all about women and documents that we pulled together to honor the centennial of women's suffrage. And so within that collection, there are drawings of a woman named Emma Edwards Green. And if you look at that drawing and then you look at this statue, hopefully you'll start to see some resemblances. Emma Edwards Green is the woman who designed Idaho's state seal. And she designed that right after we became a state in 1890. We are the only state to believe to have our state seal designed by a woman. What's unique about our seal, and I hope you guys do a quick Google search to say, what does the state seal look like if you don't know? It has a man and a woman standing at equal footing and at equal stature, meaning they're the same height. There's equality in those two roles. And they are surrounded by the wealth of resources that Idaho has to offer. But what Emma really put forth in her drawing was an acknowledgement that women always had a place in Idaho, historically, in the present, and into the future. And the symbolism that we incorporated into the statue draws from that state seal design. So again, always thinking about how can we take something from the past, interpret it for the present, and move it forward so we can continue to learn from it in the future. So those are my case studies. And in kind of walking you through those three moments in Idaho history, I hope that you were at least partially able to see how a historian might go about learning more about that topic. So again, I've given you like the high level. So I encourage all of you to now go back to whichever one of those was your favorite and say, I want to learn more about X, and here are my research questions. What are the how questions? What are the why questions? What are the what questions? What are the who questions you want to dig deeper into about that topic? Write those down, right? Historians need to have a plan or they are going to get into so many rabbit holes. And I am guilty of this myself, but you've got to stay on track and on target if you want to finish your project, finish your paper, come to that conclusion that you're seeking. So this slide really shows the process that I follow for all of the projects that I work on internally for the agency and, in also doing historical research for other stakeholders. So once you have those questions established, like I said, you have to make a plan. The QR code on this slide should take you to a research and citation management system called Zotero. This is an open source software. I use it in my daily work. It's a great way to organize your primary source research and even your secondary source research, which again, a secondary source are things written by historians using primary sources. A primary source is something captured or created in the moment of time in which you're studying. You need both to really be able to tell a good story. Organizing things into various categories that you're then going to investigate and do research in is critical before you start the research phase. So that planning step, that second step in my approach, I call reconnaissance. You've got to know what you're going to look at before you go look at it, because then you can prioritize. Once you have that prioritized list ready to go, then you put on your investigator hat and you say, I'm going to go dig into those records. But I'm going to dig fast and I'm going to dig efficiently. And I'm going to capture and capture and capture my stuff while I can at the archive where it's held, or at the library where it's held. And I'm going to bring photocopies of all that stuff back to my home or my office. And that's when you move into step 4. And you review what you've captured, and you summarize what you've captured, and you literally start writing drafts of your source documentation. And maybe through that process of step 4, you realize, wow, there was a collection I should have touched to answer my question. There's something I need to go back and look at. So you can always go back to step 2. But if you feel confident that you captured everything and you're summarizing and you're writing, by the time you get to step 5, you are not facing that dreaded white screen on your word processor with nothing to go on, because you've got drafted summaries, you've got a good understanding of what you've touched, and you can just start plugging things together, which helps immensely, because the hardest part of writing, the hardest part of content creation is getting started. So I'm, again, happy to share my slide deck so that people can look at this and study it in more depth. But having a system like this means that you're following and honoring those traditional historical research methodologies, but you're also doing so in a way that allows you to be quick and agile and efficient, and that you can do a project and leave the breadcrumbs behind for the next historian to pick up and say, she thought X about women's history. I think Y about women's history. How can I follow her breadcrumbs to see if we come to the same conclusion or not, right? So that's why the methodology is so important. So with that, I have come to the close of my talk, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Hi, HannaLore. Okay, there is a couple questions. Actually,
Great.
I had a question for you. I'm gonna let me see if I can put us a little more visible.
I can stop sharing too, so that'll help.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could share with everyone, when we had talked on the phone, one of the topics that I thought was really cool, and so I just wanted to mention it, was about the original capital. And I was wondering if you could just share with everybody about that, because I'm not sure everybody knows that.
Sure, absolutely. So in the Nez Perce story, when I was talking about how that tribe had an influence on Idaho history because there was gold discovered there, that was the impetus for the creation of the territory in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln selected William Wallace as his first territorial governor. He had been living in Washington. He was very plugged into the mining craze that was happening in the West. He selected the town of Lewiston as Idaho's first territorial capital. And Lewiston is at the confluence of the Clearwater River and the Snake River, right along what is now the Idaho-Washington border. And at the time of the selection of that location as the territorial capital, the mines were booming. But much like mining history in other parts of the country, booms bust. So pretty quickly after Lewiston became the territorial capital, they discovered gold in Boise, and people flooded from Lewiston to Boise. And the fact that there was this movement, again, mass movement of people put into the minds of the representatives in the territorial legislature, this need to kind of be where the action was. And so they passed legislation to move the capital. But there's some controversy around this, in that based on the enabling acts and the legislation from the creation of Idaho Territory, they may or may not have had the authority to actually move the capital. So by the time they get to Boise and they set themselves up to do their work, the people who had remained in Lewiston were like, wait a minute, was this allowed? Are you allowed to do this? And the decision ultimately went to the territorial Supreme Court, and those Supreme Court justices did ultimately air or you know vote or make their opinion that it was legal to have moved the capital. And plus, a couple of years had passed, the momentum had really gotten behind them. But in Lewiston, the place where that Capitol building originally existed, there is a replica building there now. And we have photographs of what we believe to be the original Capitol in Lewiston. And so if you've ever been up that part of the state and you drive through, they're very proud of the fact that they were the first territorial capital. And you can learn more about this particular story through exhibitions at the current state capitol in the rotunda and kind of on the wings. There's some really good interpretation there.
Oh, cool. We have a question about so the story you were telling about the settlers arriving in Idaho and seeing just how barren it was. Someone is asking, do you know about when did the irrigation system get started?
Mm.
And was it a private effort, a state effort, a joint effort? Do you know a little bit about that?
Yes, I do. I'm happy to answer that question. And great question. So like I said, most people were coming and they went through Idaho and they got to Oregon and California and Washington. And then they discovered gold and people came back to Idaho. We're one of the only states in the West where our migration patterns went west to east instead of east to west. And in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln passed a law called the Homestead Act that allowed for people to acquire lands as long as they promised to prove them up, meaning make them better. They could then acquire title and ownership to the land. So, of course, people went after the best land first, and the best land had access to water.
Mm.
The laws in the West stipulated that if you were the first in time to use a water source, you had right to that water in perpetuity, meaning forever after, as long as you continued to use that water in the same quantity for a beneficial use. And that's typically described as agriculture, ranching, industry came later. And so you can imagine that, again, people are flooding out here. They don't know really what they're going to find. They take up the land that has good access to water first. They start using that water. Typically, homesteaders and immigrants were responsible for figuring out how to get water to their land first. So again, that's why they chose the best land first. Once that was all gone, the federal government realized, wow, we have to change how we're giving land away so that more people will acquire it. So they started offering larger sections of land that maybe didn't require water, but you could ranch, you could graze. Then all that land was taken. So then by the time you get to 1902, Congress realized the federal government has to have a bigger hand in developing water infrastructure. And they passed the Newlands Act, which is also known as the Reclamation Act, which created the Federal Bureau of Reclamation. This pumped federal dollars into communities all across the West to build major dams, major canals, major infrastructure. So you see the Magic Valley really taking off from an irrigation standpoint after the Newlands Act passed in 1902 because there was funding.
Mm.
But the caveat that I'll throw in here is that before that law came into effect, there was another law passed in 1894 known as the Carey Act. And the Carey Act also had an impact in the Magic Valley, specifically in southern Idaho generally, whereby individual companies and corporations and individuals could basically pay to build the water infrastructure in exchange for the lands that would be irrigated. Generally, the Carey Act was a failure, a federal effort that didn't work because no one had the money and it was too expensive to build this infrastructure on your own. Hence why 10 years later they passed the Newlands Reclamation Act. But in Idaho, the Carey Act had more success than anywhere else. And so the Milner Dam, I think, was a Carey Act project, and that's one of the irrigation projects that's right in the Magic Valley.
Oh, wow.
I could give a whole talk on water.
I definitely want to look into some of the the acts that you described and get those resources to my group, because that's really interesting. Because
Mhm.
I mean, as you know how the Magic Valley is. I mean, it's just agriculture everywhere, right?
Mhm.
And so, speaking of agriculture, we have to at least hit on one thing about potatoes because it's Idaho, right?
Mhm.
So, do you know when potatoes started to become a large agricultural crop here, and how the potatoes started?
Yeah. So the potato has an interesting history in Idaho. It is believed that they first arrived in the 1840s with not Mormon, with Jesuit missionaries in kind of the Panhandle area. William, ooh, I'm going to get his first name wrong. Um, the Harmons, Harmon. I'll double check the name, but there were missionaries that were in kind of central/northern Idaho that came and brought kind of indigenous potatoes and started
Mm.
farming those. But it was really in the 1930s, late 1920s, 1930s, when the Idaho Potato Commission formed. And J.R. Simplot and that whole family was really integral to pushing the potatoes as this very Idaho thing. You know, the soil conditions here really allow for their growth on a large scale. But
Mhm.
Simplot learned, during the 30s and into World War II, how to freeze and process onions. And that he had a major contract with the US government to furnish
Mm.
cut frozen onions to the war effort. And in perfecting that method with onions, he then moved on to doing that with potatoes after the war and secured a contract with the McDonald's Corporation to provide their restaurants with frozen potatoes. So, between his efforts on a large scale through those contracts and the Potato Commission's brilliant marketing schemes, that is why Idaho is known as, this haven for potato growers. But in reality, we actually grow more onions than we do potatoes.
Do we?
Yes, we do.
I know that I don't have the exact figure, so I don't wanna misspeak, but I know we're up there in the top 10 of agricultural producers. I mean, Idaho is
Yes.
such an important place for growing food, and, I mean,
Mhm.
anybody knows this who's tried to grow anything here. There are a lot of rules.
Yes.
And even with bringing in different types of plants and things like that, I know that over the past few years, when we first moved to Idaho, you could buy grapevines and plant them, but now that is even, something that is very difficult to bring in, and the reason is because, they don't want disease to spread because
Right.
it is such an important part of Idaho and feeding so
Mhm.
many people that if
Yep.
you bring in something with a disease and then that spreads, it could really cause a big problem.
Yes.
So we produce
Absolutely.
more onions than potatoes. That's interesting. Do you know where these onions mostly are grown? Maybe I'm missing it or haven't seen it.
I think that it's like Adams County, Washington County, kind of east or west of the Treasure
Okay.
Valley. But I'd have to look at a map to really know
I'll have to
the,
find out. I
the
love that
locations.
actually because, I don't know if you've ever driven through California, but if you get up to, I think it's like Gilroy, if that's the right name of the town, you drive through there and you just smell garlic everywhere because they grow
Wow.
so much garlic. Um, Amazing experience actually. If you ever have the opportunity, it's really just unbelievable. And so I'm curious about the onions. I'll have to find this out and see where it is.
Mhm.
Maybe we can drive through some of that and see it. But,
Yes.
anyway, I don't have any more questions on here, but I any of your resources and things like that, if you send it to me, I will put it in the descriptions. I can at least do that on YouTube, I'm not sure. I can post them in Facebook, and then
Okay.
I can add it to the description on YouTube, and I can make sure everybody gets everything. So,
Perfect.
do you have anything else?
Well,
Or
I just want to reiterate that the Idaho State Historical Society is a resource for educators all across the state, and that, of
Mhm.
course, includes our homeschool community. And I am happy and honored to have been able to speak with you all this morning. And if you ever have any other questions about Idaho history, my email is my first name dot last name at ishs.idaho.gov.
Perfect. I know. I'm so excited to bring this resources to the homeschooling community, make it more widely accessible. Just things like this, people can, from the comfort of their home, get
Mhm.
some Idaho history. I think it's a great thing. So thank you so much for coming. I'm really appreciative.
Of course.
All
Yeah, of
right.
course.
Thanks, Hannah
Okay,
Lori.
thanks so much. Uh-huh.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.